"Mom, you need to stop wasting my inheritance. That money is mine and you're throwing it away on strangers." He thought the papers in his hand ended the conversation. By tomorrow morning, he'd learn the only name that ever mattered on those accounts was mine, and that I'd be long gone. Let me take you back. I have lived in the same cedar-shingled craftsman on Northwest Federal Street for 40 years. It sits off Galveston Avenue on the west side of Bend, Oregon, close enough to the old mill that on a quiet morning you can hear the Deschutes running cold over the rocks. My father bought the lot the year I was born. He built the porch himself 2 summers of weekends, and he set a brass house number into the post with his own hands. People who don't know me see a small old house on a nice street. They don't see what it costs to keep it. They never did. My name is Sylvia Underhill. I am 67 years old. For 31 years, I sat in the Deschutes County Courthouse with a steno machine in my lap, and I caught every word that was ever said in those rooms. Lawyers talked over me, judges talked past me, defendants begged and prosecutors postured and witnesses lied. And through all of it, I sat with my hands moving and my face still, and I got it down. Verbatim. Every word in the right order attributed to the right mouth. They thought I was furniture. They thought I was the girl who just types. I let them think it. There is a particular kind of power in being the person no one bothers to watch. My father, Elias Underhill, died believing I would lose everything he built. He never said it cruelly. He said it the way you'd warn a child about a hot stove. "Sylvia," he told me. The last winter he was alive, snow piling on Aubrey Butte outside the window. "You're careful. Careful is good, but careful gets bullied. There's people who'll smile at you and take the chair right out from under you." I told him I could hold my own. He patted my hand the way he always did, and he didn't argue. And I understood later that he hadn't been reassured. He spent his life quietly making sure that whether I could hold my own or not, it wouldn't matter. I just didn't know it yet. I should tell you about the lockbox because everything turns on it, and I want you to see it the way I saw it for 38 years. It was olive green, the color of old army surplus, with a brass latch worn smooth on the front, fireproof, heavy as a sleeping cat. My father kept it on the top shelf of the hall closet, and when he was dying, he had me move it to the bottom drawer of my own bedroom dresser. "When you need it," he said, "you'll know." I thought it was deeds and his Navy discharge and maybe my mother's wedding ring. I opened it once, years ago, just enough to see there were papers and an envelope, and something about the way it was all arranged so neatly made me close it again. It felt like reading a letter that wasn't finished. I left it. For 38 years, I left it. On top of the papers, I knew was a sealed envelope in my father's handwriting, 3 words on the front in his careful block letters. "Open when he tries." I never knew who he was. My father had a way of writing things that only made sense later. I assumed he meant some lawyer, some bank, some faceless man in a suit who'd come for the house someday. I never once thought it meant my own son. You'll forgive an old woman for that. There are some sentences you cannot read correctly until the day you have to. There was something else my father gave me, and I want you to hold on to it, because it doesn't pay off for a long while. When I was 9 years old, he pressed a small brass key into my palm. It hung on a ribbon, faded now to the color of weak tea. "This is yours," he said, "for when you need a door of your own." I asked him what door. He just folded my fingers over it. I wore it as a girl, lost interest as a teenager, and for most of my adult life, it lived in my jewelry box, tarnishing, a sentimental thing I couldn't throw away and couldn't explain. A door of your own. I had a whole house. I never understood what he meant. I would eventually. The morning I understood, I was already packing. My life, the one Dexter called wasting, looked like this. I woke at 5 because 31 years of being early is not a habit you put down. I made coffee in the same percolator. I read the paper at the kitchen table, the good oak table my father also built, and on Sundays I went down to the AME church potluck 2 blocks south, and I brought a peach cobbler in a dish I'd had since 1988. I sat with women I'd known for decades. I helped clean up after. On Wednesdays, I drove a widow named Mrs. Halloran to her doctor because she lived next door and her hips were bad and her own children were 3 states away. I gave to the church building fund. I paid the vet bill when a stray cat showed up under my porch with a torn ear, and then I fed her. And then there were 2 cats, and my son started calling them the strays, the way some people say a word they've decided to despise. That was the catalog of my crimes. Cobbler, a neighbor, 2 cats, a church roof. To Dexter, every dollar of it was theft from him. My son, Dexter Underhill, is 38. I will try to be fair to him because I carried him and I love him still, in the worn-down way you love a grown child who has disappointed you in a manner you can't fully forgive. He was a charming boy. He was a restless man. He got into real estate the way some men get into gambling, with a story about how this one was different, and for a few years it almost was. Then he bought a flip-out in Redmond at the top of the market, sank money he didn't have into granite countertops nobody wanted, and watched it sit. I learned later there was a second mortgage. I learned later the creditors were calling his cell so often he'd stopped answering numbers he didn't know, and his wife, Brenna, was due with their first in August. He was drowning. I want you to understand that because cruelty makes more sense when you know what's underneath it. It doesn't excuse it, but it explains the speed. He started talking about the money the spring before, always sideways at first. You ought to let me help you manage things, Mom. You shouldn't have to worry about all that at your age. He used the word estate, like it was already an account with his name on it. He kept circling one thing in particular, something he called the Trenton account, and he'd get this tight look when he said it. I can't even see the Trenton account, Mom. I'm trying to help you, and you've got money locked up where nobody can look at it. I told him there was nothing for him to see. He didn't believe me. He thought I was hiding it. The truth was simpler and far worse for him than hiding. But we'll get there. I should have known the Sunday dinner was different from the moment he asked for it. Dexter didn't ask to come to dinner. Dexter showed up when he wanted something and vanished when he didn't. But that week he called and asked, in a careful voice, if he could bring the family by Sunday, and could I have the cousins too, Renee and her husband Carl, and my brother's boy, Wendell. Make it a real dinner, he said, like the old days. I was so glad to be asked that I didn't hear the trap closing. I made a roast. I used the good tablecloth, the cream one with the embroidered edge that had been my mother's. I put out the matching plates. I baked a cobbler even though it wasn't a church Sunday. I set the table for 7 and I stood back and looked at it, and I was happy. Lord help me. I was happy. They came at 2. Brenna was big with the baby and quiet, and she wouldn't quite meet my eyes, which I noticed and filed away the way I file everything. Renee hugged me too long. Carl wouldn't stop checking his phone. Wendell, my brother's boy, looked like a man who'd been told to show up and not told why. We sat. We ate. The roast was good. The talk was small and a little too bright. Weather and the baby and somebody's truck, and the whole time there was a manila folder sitting on the sideboard behind Dexter that he kept glancing at, and I watched him glance at it, and the careful part of me, the part that sat in courtrooms for 31 years and learned to read a room before anyone spoke, began to go very still. I have sat through more ambushes than most lawyers. I know the shape of the silence right before someone says the thing they came to say. The plates were nearly clear. Brenna had her hands folded over her belly. Renee had stopped talking mid-sentence, and Dexter set down his fork and wiped his mouth with my mother's cream napkin and reached behind him for the folder. "Mom," he said, "we need to talk about something, and I need you to just hear me out before you get upset." I folded my hands in my lap. I did not get upset. I have never once, in 67 years, gotten upset in the way people expect a woman my age to get upset. I said, "All right, Dexter, I'm listening," because I am always listening. It is the only thing I have ever been truly good at, and it is more than enough. He opened the folder. He took out a small stack of papers, 3 or 4 pages, with a blue notary stamp on the first one, and a tab where I was meant to sign, and he slid them across my mother's cream tablecloth, past the cobbler, past the good plates, until they came to rest against my water glass. "It's a conservatorship," he said, and he said it fast, the way you rip a bandage. "It's not a bad thing, Mom. It just means I handle the money so you don't have to, so nothing happens to it. So you're protected." He took a breath. "Brenna and I think it's time you looked at a facility, a nice one. There's a place out on the east side, real nice, and they handle everything, and you wouldn't have to keep up this whole house alone." Nobody at the table moved. Renee was looking at her plate. Carl had finally put his phone down, face up, like even he knew this wasn't a moment for it. Wendell's mouth was slightly open. Brenna stared at the tablecloth. "You can't keep doing this," Dexter went on. And now there was an edge coming up under the careful voice, the edge of a man who'd rehearsed the soft version and was already losing patience with it. The church, the cats, all the giving it away to people who aren't even family. That money is supposed to come to me. You're sitting here in a house worth $500,000, feeding stray cats and writing checks to a building fund, and I'm trying to protect what's left before you fritter it all away on your church and your strays. That was when he said the line I told you about at the start. He looked me in the eye, my own son, with his unborn child in the room, and he said, "Mom, you need to stop wasting my inheritance. That money is mine, and you're throwing it away on strangers." And the room went very, very quiet. I looked at the papers against my water glass. I looked at the blue notary stamp, and I did something none of them expected. I did not cry, and I did not argue, and I did not reach for the pen. I reached for the cobbler, and I asked Renee if she'd like another piece. The room had been waiting for me to break. I could feel it the way you feel weather coming. Renee's fork hung in the air. Carl's hand twitched toward his phone and stopped. Brenna's eyes came up off the tablecloth for the first time all afternoon and landed on me with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite fear, and I have spent enough years reading faces to know the difference. What I gave them, instead of a scene, was a slice of peach cobbler, lifted clean onto Renee's plate, the spoon scraping the dish the way it had scraped that same dish for 38 years. "Dexter," I said, and my voice came out the way it always did in a courtroom when the lawyers got loud, low enough that people leaned in to catch it. "I'm going to finish my coffee. You're going to take your folder home. And on Tuesday, you and I are going to sit down with the people who actually hold these accounts, and we'll let them tell you what's what." I set the spoon down. "I think you'll find it educational." He didn't like that word. I watched it land. Educational is what you say to a child, and Dexter had spent the whole spring trying to make me into the child at the table. He opened his mouth, and Brenna put her hand on his arm, just barely, and he closed it again. The papers stayed where they were, leaned up against my water glass, the blue notary stamp facing me. And that is the moment, looking back, when I stopped being sad and started paying attention, because I read that stamp. Old habit. You sit in a courtroom long enough, you read every date on every document that crosses in front of you, you can't help it. And the date on that notary block was 2 weeks gone. 2 weeks before this dinner. Before the roast. Before the phone call asking to come. Before he ever said the word family in that careful, rehearsed voice. He had already walked into a notary's office and sworn that his mother could not manage her own affairs. I didn't say a word about it. I filed it. That is what I do. I have filed away 10,000 things people wished I hadn't heard, and this went into the drawer with the rest of them. And I poured my coffee, and I asked Wendell about his truck, and slowly, painfully, the dinner came back to life around the dead thing in the middle of the table. They left before 5. Dexter took his folder. At the door, he leaned down to kiss my cheek and said, "Just think about it, Mom. I'm doing this because I love you." And I said, "I know exactly why you're doing it, Dexter," and let him decide what that meant. Then the house was quiet, and the two cats came out from wherever they hide when there's company, and I stood in my own kitchen on Northwest Federal Street with the light going gold over Aubrey Butte through the window. And I understood that the time my father had warned me about for 40 years had finally arrived. He tries. That was the phrase on the envelope. I had read it as a man, a stranger, a bank. I had never once let myself read it as my own boy. But I am too old to lie to myself about what my eyes had just seen leaning against my water glass. I went to the bedroom. I knelt at the bottom drawer of the dresser, the one that sticks in summer, and I worked it open. And there it was where it had sat for 38 years. Olive green, brass latch worn smooth, heavy as a sleeping cat when I lifted it onto the bed. I sat beside it a long while before I touched the latch. There are some doors you don't open until you're certain you'll walk through them. Then I thumbed the latch, and it gave with the same small click I remembered from being a girl, and I lifted the lid. On top, just as I knew it would be, was the envelope in my father's careful block letters. "Open when he tries." I held it for a moment, and then I broke the seal my father had pressed down sometime before I was 30, and I read what Sylvia Underhill had written for a day he hoped would never come, and planned for anyway. My Sylvia. If you are reading this, someone you love has decided that what I built should be theirs, and they have tried to take it out of your hands. I am sorry. I hoped it would be a stranger. It is never a stranger. Underneath this letter is a deed. Read it twice, the way you read everything twice, and you will see that I never left you to be bullied. I left you in charge. The page that matters is the one I marked. Trust the marked page. Love, your father. Underneath the letter was a thick folded document. Blue legal backing gone soft at the creases, and a title across the top in the typeface of an older world, the Underhill Family Trust. And I, who had transcribed 10,000 pages of legal language without ever once owning a line of it, sat on the edge of my bed and read my father's trust the way I had been trained to read, slowly, twice, clause by clause. And I felt the floor of my whole life shift quietly under me. He had created it the year Dexter was born, 1988, the same year as the cobbler dish, as it happens, though I didn't think of that until later. The trust held the house. It held the accounts. It held, I now understood, the thing Dexter had been clawing at all spring, the one he called the Trenton account and couldn't see and couldn't stand not seeing. The account that sat behind the trust's name, where no heir's eyes could reach it. And the trust named one trustee, sole trustee. Full discretion. Not my father, not a bank, not a board of cousins. Me, Sylvia Underhill. It had named me for 38 years, and no one had told me because my father had known that the day I needed to know would announce itself, and it had, leaning against my water glass with a notary stamp 2 weeks old. Then I found the page he marked. It was a clause near the back, and my father had drawn 2 lines under it, pressed so hard the pen had nearly gone through the paper. 2 lines where one would have done. I read it once and knew the words from 100 courtrooms. A spendthrift provision. In plain speech, it said that no beneficiary, no heir, no descendant could compel the trustee to hand over $1, could not borrow against it, could not pledge it to a creditor, could not petition a court to force its release. The money could only ever move when the trustee, in her sole judgment, chose to move it. My father had built a wall around everything he owned, and he had built it the year his grandson was born, and he had put the only gate in that wall in my hands, and he had underlined the reason twice. I sat with that a long time. The light went out of the sky over the butte, and I didn't turn on a lamp. The thing I couldn't understand, the thing that kept me up past midnight at the kitchen table with the deed flat in front of me and the cats, asleep on the chair my father built, was the second line. Why twice? My father did not waste ink. He underlined for the eye that would need to find it fast. But twice was for something else. Twice was a man leaning across 38 years to make sure I didn't miss what the clause made possible. I read it again at 1 a.m. and again at 1:30, and I still did not see, that night, what he wanted me to see. 2 questions sat with me in the dark. Why would a man backdate his cruelty by 2 weeks? And why would my careful father, who never wasted a thing, underline one true sentence twice? The first question I already had the cold answer to. The second I would not understand until I had stood inside the credit union on Wall Street 2 days later, and a woman who had known my father told me the one fact that turned the lock. Tuesday morning, I dressed the way I used to dress for court. Pressed blouse, low heel, my mother's small gold earrings. I drove downtown and parked off Wall Street and walked into the credit union where my father had banked since before I could spell my own name, the deed and the letter and the marked page in a flat document folder under my arm. The branch manager came out from behind the desk when she saw me, a tall woman near 60 with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and she took my hand in both of hers. "Sylvia Underhill," she said. "I wondered if I'd see you. I'm Marion Vance. I knew your father. I was a teller here when I was young, and he used to bring you in on Saturdays and stand you up on the counter." She smiled at something behind my shoulder, some morning 40 years gone. Then she looked at the folder under my arm, and the smile changed into something more careful. "Why don't you come back to my office?" I laid it all out on her desk, the way I had laid nothing out in front of Dexter on Sunday. The trust, the clause, the accounts. I told her in the flat verbatim way I tell things that my son had brought conservatorship papers to my dinner table and that the notary date was 2 weeks before he asked to come. Marion Vance read the deed with the patience of someone who reads documents for a living, and when she got to the marked page, she stopped, and she took off her reading glasses, and she looked at me across the desk. "Sylvia," she said, "do you understand what you're holding?" I told her I thought I did. "You've been the sole trustee this whole time," she said. 38 years. Every account behind this trust has answered to your signature, and no one else's. Not your son's, not a court's, not anyone's." She set the glasses down on the deed. "You never needed anyone's permission. You never needed a single signature but your own. You've been waiting your whole life for someone to give you something your father already gave you the year your boy was born. And there it was. The second underline. My father had not marked that clause twice to tell me the money was protected. He had marked it twice to tell me what protected money could do. A wall with one gate, and I held the only key, and a gate that only opens from the inside can be walked through in either direction. The money could move when I chose to move it. To anyone. The same clause that stopped my son from pulling $1 out was the clause that let me move every dollar wherever I willed. And there was not a court in Oregon that could compel it back, because my own father had spent a lawyer's fee in 1988 making certain of exactly that. I did not smile in Marion Vance's office. I have never been a woman who smiles when the ground turns in her favor. But something I had carried in my chest since Sunday, since the notary date, since 40 years of my father patting my hand and not being reassured, set itself down quietly and was still. "Mrs. Vance," I said, "I'm going to need to understand how money moves out of a trust like this, properly, dated correctly. Every form the right way, nothing anyone can ever say was rushed or wrong." I folded my hands on the edge of her desk. I spent 31 years getting other people's words down in the right order. I'd like to get my own affairs down in the right order now, and I'm going to need the name of someone who can help me draw up a new one. Marion Vance looked at me for a moment, and then she wrote a name on a slip of paper and slid it across the desk, the way my son had slid his papers across my tablecloth, except this slid toward what I wanted instead of away from it. The name was Theo Marsh. I did not know it yet, sitting in that office on Wall Street with the morning sun coming through the blinds. But the young man whose name was on that slip of paper had been put through paralegal school by a quiet scholarship fund nobody could ever quite trace, and the man who had funded it decades before had been Elias Underhill. I met Theo Marsh 2 days later in a small office above a coffee roaster on Bond Street, 3 doors up from where the farmers set out their tables on Wednesdays. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30, in a shirt that had been ironed by someone who cared about him, and he stood when I came in and pulled the chair out and waited until I was settled before he sat back down. Manners like that are taught. You don't pick them up on your own. I noticed it the way I notice everything, and filed it, and didn't yet know what it meant. He had the deed copied and tabbed before I arrived. That told me something too. A man who reads ahead is a man who respects the document, and there are not as many of those in this world as you would hope, even among the people paid to handle them. He laid the pages out on the table between us and turned them so they faced me, not him, and he put his finger on the trust's name and looked up. "Mrs. Underhill," he said, "I want to make sure I'm reading this the way you're reading it. You're the trustee, not a co-trustee, not subject to a protector or a committee. Sole." He said the word carefully, the way I would have said it. "And this provision here, the one your father underlined, that's a spend-thrift clause, with discretionary distribution language layered on top of it, which means the beneficiaries are named, but they have no standing to demand anything. The decision to distribute, to whom, in what amount, when, or whether at all, sits with one person. With me," I said. "With you," he said, "entirely with you." I asked him how a thing like that could have sat unexercised for 38 years without a single person telling me it existed, and Theo Marsh did a thing I will remember. He set the pen down and he folded his hands the way I fold mine, and he said, "Because the man who wrote it wanted it that way. A trust like this isn't built to be used early. It's built to be there the morning somebody needs it and can't be talked out of it. Whoever drafted this knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't protecting money from the market. He was protecting it from a person. He just didn't know yet which person it would be." "It's never a stranger," I said, more to my father than to the young man across the table. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "In my experience, it never is. We worked for 3 hours that first day. I had brought my own notes in my own shorthand, the shorthand I'd built over 31 years sitting below the bench, catching every word a judge or a liar ever said. And I read him the account numbers from memory because I had read them twice the night before, and twice is all I have ever needed. He checked each one against the trust schedule, and each one matched. The house on Northwest Federal Street, the certificates at the credit union on Wall Street, and the one Dexter had been clawing at all spring, the one he kept calling the Trenton account, because that was the name on an old statement he'd found and couldn't reconcile. The account he complained he couldn't see and couldn't access and couldn't stand not being able to access. It wasn't a man named Trenton. It had never been a person at all. Trenton was the name of the trust's holding account, opened in 1988, titled to the Underhill Family Trust, reachable by exactly one signature, mine. My son had spent his savings and his sleep trying to get past a door, and the door had my name carved over it the whole time, and he had been too busy assuming I was simple to read the nameplate. I asked Theo, before I left that afternoon, how he'd come to this work. It was not idle. I asked people things for reasons. He told me he'd grown up out past Redmond, that his mother cleaned offices and there'd been no money for school, and that he'd gotten a scholarship his second year, a small fund he'd never quite been able to find the source of, administered through a lawyer's office, no name attached. "I tried to write a thank you letter once," he said, almost embarrassed. "There was nobody to send it to. The lawyer said the donor preferred it that way, said he'd told them, and I always remembered this, that he didn't want to be thanked, he wanted to be copied." I held very still in that chair above the coffee roaster. He wanted to be copied. That was my father's phrase. That was Elias Underhill's whole philosophy in 4 words. The thing he used to say to me when I was small and asking why he gave so much away when we could have kept it. He didn't want gratitude. He wanted the next person to do the same thing for the person after that. I did not tell Theo Marsh that day, whose money had sent him to school. I am not sure I could have gotten the words out level, and I do not speak when I cannot speak level. But I knew then that my father had been doing this his whole quiet life, threading a needle through strangers, and that the trust on the table was only the part of it that had my name on it. I learned the rest of it from Mrs. Halloran. She has lived next door to me on Northwest Federal Street since before my husband passed, a widow now herself, 91 this autumn, sharp as a tack on the things that matter and foggy on the things that don't, which is its own kind of wisdom, if you ask me. I brought her a plate of the cobbler on Thursday because the dish needed using and because I wanted to sit on a porch with someone who had known my father as a man and not a document. We talked about the snow that was still up on Aubrey Butte, though it was nearly summer, and about the church potluck 2 blocks down that I'd missed last Sunday for the first time in years. And then she said, out of nowhere, the way the olds say the truest things, "Your daddy saved this house, you know. Mine, I mean. This one I'm sitting in." I asked her what she meant. When Walter died, she said, "There was a note on the place I couldn't carry. I never told a soul. I was making arrangements to leave. And one morning the bank sends a letter saying it's cleared, paid in full, no name." I cried on this porch for an hour. I always thought it was the church. It wasn't the church. It was Elias. I found out years on, by accident, the way you find out everything that matters. Too late to thank the man. She looked at me with eyes gone milky, but not dim. "He never wanted thanks, your father. He used to say a thing. He used to say, 'Marion, I don't want to be thanked. I want to be copied,' I said. 'Copied,' she said, and patted my hand. And we sat there a while with the cobbler going warm in the sun, 2 women on a porch on the west side of Bend, holding the shape of a man who had spent 60 years quietly making sure the people he loved would not be at anyone's mercy. And I understood, sitting there, that the underline drawn twice was not about the money at all. It was about the method. My father had not left me a fortune. He had left me a practice, a way of moving through the world. And the second line was him saying, plainly as a dead man can say anything, "Do as I did." That night I went back to the olive green lockbox. I had emptied the top of it, the letter, the deed, the trust. But a fireproof box that heavy does not weigh that much for paper alone, and I had learned a long time ago that the thing you are looking for is usually under the thing you already found. I lifted out the false bottom, a plain steel tray my thumbnail caught on, and underneath, on a square of felt my mother must have cut, was a brass key on a faded ribbon. I knew that key. I had not seen it in 60 years, and I knew it the instant the light touched it. My father gave it to me when I was 7, pressed it into my palm on the front steps of this very house, and closed my small fingers over it and said, in that low voice that made you lean in, "Hold on to this, Sylvia. It's a door of your own, for when you need one." I had thought it was a game. I lost it within a week, or believed I had, cried about it, and he had only smiled and said not to worry, that a real key has a way of turning up the day the door appears. I had carried the phrase my whole life without the key, a door of your own. I had wondered, at low moments in a long marriage and a longer career, where on earth my door was supposed to be. It was in the box the whole time. He had taken it back the week I lost it and laid it under the false bottom of a fireproof box, and waited 38 years for me to have a reason to look that deep. There was a tag on the ribbon in his block letters gone soft, a number, and the name of the credit union on Wall Street, a safe deposit box. I did not sleep that night, and I did not need to. In the morning, I dressed for court again, my mother's earrings, my low heel, and I drove down to Wall Street, and Marion Vance walked me back into the vault herself and stood with her back turned to give me what privacy a vault can give. The brass key turned in the lock the way a true thing turns. No resistance, like it had been oiled yesterday. Inside the long steel drawer were two things. The first was a folder of successor papers, drawn up decades ago and updated, I could see, more than once, a clean framework waiting for a name to be written into it. A new trust, sitting ready, the way a good carpenter leaves the next board cut before he sets down his saw. The second was a deed, a small house paid in full in a town 3 states away that I will not name here, a place with a kitchen table and a window, and the photograph clipped to it showed a porch. Bought 11 years ago, held in the trust, waiting for when you need a door of your own. I sat down on the little stool in the vault and I held that deed in both hands, and for the first time since Dexter slid his folder across my Sunday cloth, I felt the whole architecture of it, the lockbox, the letter, the clause, the key, the school he paid for, the mortgage he cleared, the house he bought and never told me about. My father had not left me a defense. He had left me a way out, fully built, fully furnished, the door cut and hung, and the key already in my hand since I was 7 years old. All I had ever had to do was stop waiting for permission and turn it. I drove home and I called Theo Marsh, and I told him I wanted to draft a new irrevocable trust, and that I knew exactly whose name went in it, and that it was not Dexter Underhill's. He was quiet a moment on the line, and then he said, "And the beneficiary, Mrs. Underhill?" And I told him about a young woman from the church 2 blocks down, a single mother named Renata, who cleaned rooms at one of the resorts out toward the old mill and was raising a boy alone and had never once asked me or anyone for a thing she wasn't owed, which is to say, had never asked for anything at all. "She's not family," Theo said, and I could hear he was testing it, the way I would have tested it. "No," I said, "she isn't. That's rather the point. My father didn't build this for blood. He built it for the next person who'd do right with it. I intend to copy him." There was a pause on the line, and then Theo Marsh said something that told me Marion Vance had chosen the right young man to write on her slip of paper. He said, "Then we should make sure every page is dated correctly and every transfer is clean, and there's nothing anyone can ever say was rushed or wrong." "Yes," I said. "Let's get it down in the right order. I've spent 31 years getting other people's affairs down in the right order. I find I have a feeling for it." We set the meeting for the following week, and I sat down that evening at my own kitchen table, with the deed and the key and the trust laid out in front of me and the 2 cats asleep on the chair my father built, and I began, in my own careful hand, to write down everything I would say to my son when he came back for his answer. I'll write the final block now, continuing the narration directly. The next morning came, and I did the thing in the right order, the way I have done everything in the right order my whole life. Theo Marsh met me at the credit union on Wall Street before it opened, in a pressed shirt and with 2 pens, because a careful man always brings a second pen, and Marion Vance unlocked the side door and let us in, past the dark teller windows, and put on a single light over the back table, so we would not be sitting in the public glare. We laid the new instrument out flat between us. Theo read each page aloud, slowly, and I followed every word, and where he paused, I said the next clause before he reached it, not to show off, but because I had read it 4 times, and 4 times is more than enough for me. The Underhill Family Trust would terminate by the trustee's own hand. Its holdings, every certificate, the Trenton holding account opened in 1988, the proceeds of the house, if it ever sold, would pour into a new irrevocable trust, and the new trust named one beneficiary, and the name was Renata, and a successor framework named the next careful person after her, and the next after that, a line of doors stretching out past my own life. I signed where my father had made certain, decades before I understood it, that only my signature would ever do. Marion Vance witnessed it with her own hand and stamped it and looked at me over her glasses and said, he'd have wanted to see this. I told her he had seen it. He had seen all of it the year my boy was born, sitting at a lawyer's desk imagining this exact morning, and he had simply trusted me to arrive on time. The transfers cleared by 10. I asked the teller to print the confirmations on paper, the long kind with the account lines and the zero balances, and she did. And I folded them into my handbag next to my mother's earrings, and I drove home up the west side with the snow still bright on Aubrey Butte and the Deschutes running cold under the bridge, and I made a pot of coffee, and I waited for my son. He came Sunday, the way the proud always come back to the same table to collect what they are sure is theirs. The cousins were there again, summoned by Dexter the way you summon witnesses you expect to nod, and I had set the table with the good cloth and the cobbler dish, and I had folded my hands when the doorbell rang, and I did not unfold them in a hurry. He sat in his father's old chair. He had the same leather folder. He slid it toward me across the cloth, and I watched it come, and I did not touch it. "You've had your week," Dexter said. "I hope you used it to get used to the idea. The facility in Redmond has a room. I need the conservatorship signed today, Mom, for your own good." I looked at my son for a long moment, the boy I had taught to tie his shoes on the front steps of this house on Northwest Federal Street, and then I reached down beside my chair and lifted the olive green lockbox onto the table, and I thumbed the brass latch, and it gave with the small, clean sound it had made the first night I opened it. "Before you collect," I said, "let me show you a few things in the right order. I spent 31 years getting other people's words down in the right order. Indulge me." I took out the deed first and laid it flat, page by page, turning each one to face him the way Theo had turned the pages to face me. "This is the original trust your grandfather drew. Read the line at the top. Trustee, not co-trustee, not subject to a committee. Sole. That has been my title since the year you were born. You have spent this spring trying to break into a house, Dexter, and my name was carved over the door the whole time." His jaw worked. One of the cousins, Lorna, leaned forward to look, and Dexter put his hand flat on the cloth to stop her, and I went on as if neither of them had moved. "This is the next page." I set the clause down. "Your grandfather underlined it twice. A spendthrift provision with discretionary distribution. In plain speech, the beneficiaries are named, but no beneficiary, not you, not anyone, has standing to compel a single dollar out of it. You cannot petition it loose. You cannot sue it loose. You cannot wait me out, because it does not pass the way you've been telling these good people it passes." I looked around the table at the cousins, at Lorna and at Marcus, and at the younger one whose name I always have to reach for, and I said gently, "It was never coming to him the way he told you. He needed you to believe it was, so you'd sit here and nod." "That's a lie," Dexter said, but quietly, because he had begun to feel the floor move. "This is the third thing," I said, and I set down a copy of his own petition, the one from the leather folder, and I turned it so the notary block faced the room. "Look at the date on the stamp. Now look at the date on the dinner. 2 weeks apart. You had this notarized before you ever sat at my table and called my church and my strays a waste. You didn't decide that Sunday that I was slipping. You decided weeks before that you needed me declared unfit, and then you came to perform the discovery of it in front of family. That is not concern. That has a name in the law, and it is not a kind one." The room was very quiet. The cobbler steamed. Marcus sat back from the table an inch, the way a man sits back from something he does not want on him. "And this is the last thing," I said. And I drew the confirmations out of my handbag and unfolded them and laid them down. The long pages with the account lines and the zeros. The Trenton account you kept complaining you couldn't see. The certificates. All of it. As of yesterday morning, it is moved. Legally, cleanly, dated, witnessed, into an irrevocable trust your grandfather's framework made room for and I made real. You may have your lawyer look. There's nothing there to look at." He stared at the zeros. "I have watched 1,000 faces take in a verdict from my little machine below the bench, and I know the exact moment the words land. the half second where a person stops arguing with the world and starts arguing with themselves. It was never your inheritance, Dexter, I said. It was my trust. And as of this morning, there is nothing left for you to petition. He broke then, not loudly, but all the way through. And what came out of him was the truth I had known since the first Sunday and had been waiting with a stenographer's patience for him to say out loud. The flip in Redmond had collapsed. There was a second mortgage on his own house and a third lien he hadn't told his wife about. The creditors were calling the cell phone he kept face down at dinner, and the baby, my grandchild, was due in the autumn. I wasn't stealing it, he said, and his voice cracked on the word, and I believe he believed it. I was protecting it. It's coming to me anyway. I was just protecting what's mine. That was how he had slept. He had built himself a man who safeguards, so he would not have to meet the man who steals from his mother. I did not raise my voice. I have never needed to. A child due in the fall, I said, and you spent your last savings hiring a man to have your mother declared incompetent instead of sitting in that chair and saying, "Mom, I am drowning." If you had asked me as my son, I would have helped you as your mother. You came to take me as a debtor, and there is a difference, and the difference is the whole of it. He asked me, with the last of his pride, what he was supposed to do now. "You're going to be a father," I said. I would start there. And then I stood, and I picked up the olive green lockbox, and inside it, beside the felt my mother had cut, the worn brass key lay on its faded ribbon, the one my father pressed into my hand on these steps when I was 7, and took back the week I thought I'd lost it, and kept for 38 years against this morning. I closed the lid over it. I had already turned the lock it was cut for. I did not need to explain that to anyone in the room, and I did not. I drove out that afternoon. I had packed the night before, 2 cases and the cats in their carriers and the lockbox on the seat beside me, and I went out past the old mill and crossed the Deschutes one last time and pointed the car east as the light came down gold over the butte. And by the next morning, when Dexter called the house and let it ring and ring, I was 3 states gone, exactly as I had decided I would be, owing no one an answer. What I did not arrange, but what the careful arranging set loose on its own, came after. The backdated petition did not simply vanish when I did. A clerk at the county flagged the notary date against the filing, the way clerks who read twice will, and the file moved to a desk it was never meant to reach, and a woman from Adult Protective Services opened a financial exploitation referral in the name of an Underhill, and for once it was not me being protected from the market, but a system turning, slowly, toward the right person. The same date that hanged him with me put a complaint on the desk of the state bar against the attorney who had stamped a conservatorship 2 weeks before the family even pretended to discover a reason for it. I heard later that the attorney took down the shingle that hung outside his office near the courthouse, and that the next mother who walked in drowning would not find that particular door open to do to her what was nearly done to me. I keep a small house now, 3 states away, in a town I will let stay nameless, with a kitchen table by a window and a porch that gets the morning. Renata came out last month with her boy, who is 6 and shy and has my father's habit of reading the back of the cereal box twice. I sat her down at the table and folded my hands and laid the papers in front of her, one at a time, turned so they faced her and not me, and I told her what was hers and what could never be taken loose from her by anyone, including by anyone she might one day love and trust. She cried, the way Mrs. Halloran cried on her porch, and asked me how she could ever thank me, and I told her the truth my father taught me with 4 quiet words, that I did not want to be thanked. I wanted her to do it again, someday for the next person, and to leave the door cut and hung before she set down her saw. The olive green lockbox sits on the shelf by that window, mine now to pass on, the brass key inside it on its ribbon, waiting on the shelf for the morning a girl will need it. She holds every key now,